I'm super excited to be interviewing you today and talking a bit more about your background and your experiences and insights and all of that fun stuff. So thank you so much for sitting down with me.
My pleasure. I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
I'd love to hear a bit more about your career journey and how you came to specialize as a fractional COO and CDO in biotech. Obviously, the prominence of fractional executive roles has risen a lot, not just in biotech, but across industries these past few years. So I'd love to hear more about your take on what's driving the rise and how you ended up in this role and just your overall journey here.
Yeah, no problem. And I'll try to be concise. Clinical research journeys tend to be long and winding. I stumbled onto clinical research out of college. When I was in college, I really had no idea what I wanted to do, where my path was going to take me. And I found myself working at a large Intermountain Cancer Hospital right where I went to college when I graduated. And uh, working for a physician who was heavily involved in clinical research, both investigator-initiated trials and, of course, industry research, as well as a lot of stuff via the NCI, et cetera. And that really opened my eyes to sort of what was going on, what clinical research looked like at the site level, how patients participated, but also interacting with CRAs, interacting with industry, and getting involved in that world, especially, well, I'll date myself here a little bit, 20 plus years ago. It was really easy also to identify a lot of the things that weren't working well. And in that process of being a clinical research coordinator and kind of growing up at the site level, I became really passionate about what it would be like to work at a sponsor within industry. I wanted to sit at the table where the protocol was being written, because a lot of the protocols I received, they clearly didn't understand my role as a coordinator, what was possible within a given amount of time. And just picture you're running all over the hospital. You've never taken an ECG before, and all of a sudden you've got to figure out how to do that. I got phlebotomy certified. I learned how to spin blood. I did all kinds of stuff that I'd never done, which was really, really exciting. But I also got to learn from all of the physicians working up there and really got to directly interact with patients. And that I think also really helped me kind of unlock a passion for this industry. At the end of the day, that patient, that should be our North Star for this industry. We're working to develop better therapies for patients. And that, still drives me to this day, having interacted with those patients and those families and those, very, very serious medical situations. And so I'll kind of give you the short version from there. Site CRO moved into that sponsor world. It was a goal that I put forth pretty early on and was very important to me. I've worked at large and small sponsors. I've worked in startups, grew up in the industry within clinical operations on the sponsor side. So what that really looks like is the folks that operationalize clinical trials. We have a medical director, a chief medical officer, scientific advice on how to build a scientifically sound protocol for whatever molecule, drug, device we're looking at. But ultimately, those protocols have to be operationalized. And that's where clinical operations come in. We're often the unsung heroes of drug development. We're silently working in the background. The role in the regulations of clinical operations of the sponsor is to oversee the clinical trial. Of course, we outsource to CROs. Even large sponsors outsource portions of their business to CROs. We use a lot of specialty vendors, but ultimately the sponsor is responsible for overseeing the trial, for making sure that it's conducted in a compliant manner according to regulations, and the data that we're getting, is sound. And so I really found a lot of passion for that. And I loved that I was touching medicine and science, but also the law and regulations and the FDA and regulators in other geographies, and getting a really good global viewpoint of how drug development works. I moved from bigger companies into smaller companies, strategically kind of in the middle there, because I loved the idea of kind of getting to put my own stamp on what a clinical operations department could look and feel like. I love building teams. I love building up individuals. And it was my chance to, I think, get a broader skill set or a broader understanding of how the industry works. Working in a small company is a couple things. It's wearing a lot of hats. It's getting to try things you've not necessarily tried before, but it's also sitting at tables that maybe you weren't sitting at before. How does drug manufacturing work? How do the preclinical people arrive at the studies that they conduct? How do we get a molecule ready to file an IND? And how do we get it to the point where we even can test in humans? And working in small startups gave me a lot more insight and access to the folks that were doing other work within biotech. And it also allowed me to start expanding my own skill set through kind of that, everyone kind of has their hands in the pot. We all kind of jump in, and I through working on those small teams really had an opportunity to learn a lot of other skill sets that are sort of adjacent to clinical operations, which is sort of how I grew into a development operations leader. Things went from there. At the end of 2023, the company that I was working at, heading up development operations, was acquired. And in biotech, these are things we get really excited about. It's great to be acquired. It's exciting. It's a big pharma. At the same time, you may or may not be aware that the past couple of years in biotech have been really, really tough. I have been in full-time FTE roles really my entire career. Never really went the consulting route. Was lucky to find, my next role each time, often, recruited into various roles. But this time I found myself looking for a job in a very different sort of market, a market where each company is looking for their unicorn. And there are so many folks in the market that they have the ability to do that. It is very much a recruiters or hiring managers market right now. And so I took an opportunistic angle on that and leaned into some fractional leadership roles for executives who I knew. These were folks I'd worked with before, CMOs, CEOs that I'd worked with previously that needed help with various things, getting things ready for fundraising, thinking through operational plans, clinical operations plans, how really to make sure that their plan was operationally sound. And 2024 for me was great. I sort of had one job after the next through a couple of really close connections that I've worked with previously. But coming up to 2025, I really realized that there's a huge market for fractional leadership right now. And I'll get into your question in a moment. And that, the FTE market is still very, very unstable. Folks are reluctant to invest in expensive executives where their fundraising path feels very uncertain. They don't necessarily have the funding to bring on executives full time, but they still need that executive level strategic support. So I think fractional leadership has emerged as a result of the market. Plenty of really talented folks out there that can help companies, but companies don't necessarily need someone full time at that seed stage, especially, or when they're still formulating their thoughts and plans around what their company is going to be. And so we've seen a lot of fractional leaders emerge from this, stepping in to help companies for a period of several months or a percentage of their time. And it's beneficial across the board. It helps those founders and those executives really diversify their skill set and bring on the folks, the expertise that they need. It also allows them not to necessarily get really bogged down with a lot of heavy headcount and salaries and so on and so forth that these small companies can't sustain. It also allows the executives out there to demonstrate their skill sets to different founders, to build that relationship with them. It's almost a try before you buy. If that company is successful in raising money, a lot of times these fractionals join full time. That can happen. But I think the movement that we've seen with fractional leadership is in response to the market, where you have a lot of candidates that are looking for work, a lot of companies that need support, and we're being a little bit more creative about how we get there these days. So I've been doing some of that. And in addition to that, some strategic consulting for companies that I call biotech adjacent. What I mean by that is they're operating in the biotech space. They're providing products or services to biotech or pharma companies, and they may or may not know that space well. Very very tricky space to kind of get to know. We see folks coming in with great new tech, for example, that don't necessarily know how to speak biotech, speak pharma. And so I've really enjoyed getting to know some of those companies, CROs, tech companies, other vendors that provide specialty services to biotech companies, site networks that really need some help understanding how to navigate the biotech world. It also calls out to me how many silos that still exist in our world. Sponsors, CROs, vendors, sites. We're all out there, to provide better care, to develop better drugs for patients, but we don't speak the same languages. We're often not on the same page in terms of how to get the results that we want. And therefore, I think that's a huge contributing factor to why we see such long development timelines, a lot of product failures, and let's face it, the drug development space is incredibly, incredibly expensive. So let me pause there. I've said quite a bit, and I want to make sure I can answer any questions.
Oh no, that was incredible. Thank you so much. Side note, I love the shout out to patient centricity. I think that's such an important shift that we're seeing in the industry. And I really appreciated the overview of your career path and your take on sort of the benefits of these fractional roles, not just for companies themselves, but also for people who are interested in pursuing that as a potential career path and the sort of flexibility that brings. So thank you. That was super insightful. I think I would like to sort of on the talking about your experience and all of these different companies you've worked for in so many different shapes and sizes. I would love to talk about some of the sort of common high-level patterns that you've seen amongst companies that are able to scale successfully versus those that are struggling.
Yeah, sure. So, one piece here that's really important, bluntly, is funding and thinking through that strategy, and that's a long topic. And we may not have time to get into some of the challenges that folks are having lately, but I think it's being really smart about the capital that you have. A lot of folks start with a seed round, and a seed round allows you to sort of get your legs underneath you and bring in some support, whether that's consultants, whether that's fractional leadership, and allows you to really, structure some pitch decks, some operational plans, really think through what your next preclinical steps are, clinical steps, manufacturing. There's a lot of infrastructure that's needed for a biotech company. And so really kind of thinking through what capital you need when is really important. One thing that's important to note about biotech companies is unless you have a commercialized product, you don't have any revenue. There is no product until you get that FDA or commercial approval. So you're operating off of the money that you can raise, whether that be venture capital or private equity, whether that be on the open market if you've been through an IPO. And so you're very, very resource constrained. And so thinking very critically about what help you need, what resources you need from a team building perspective, and staging that as you need them is important. I think fractional leadership is one way, one newer way that folks are doing that. I think consultants, though, have been brought in, for quite a long time in order to provide some types of support, whether that be individual consultants or consulting firms. They may come in to provide regulatory support, for example. We obviously outsource to CROs and other vendor partners, and building partnerships and evaluating the right fit is something that I encourage sponsors to do really early. Really think through not just what you might need for a phase 1 trial, but what your development program is going to look like going forward. So a lot of this is just planning and planning and planning and planning for different types of scenarios. And it can often be really exciting to get funding or to get data, whether it be preclinical or clinical, but not to put the cart before the horse. It's really exciting to think, oh my goodness, we should go out and build a team. Well, slowing down and kind of walking before you run is really important, so that you don't kind of overblow that team, end up with so many resources, and then you see companies having to scale back. and that happens frequently. Now, this isn't always intentional. In fact, it's hardly ever intentional. I think companies are always built with the right, the right intentions, the right the right North Star, if you will, that patient. But the reality is, again, we see a lot of programs that fail at one stage or another, and the teams that it takes internally to run those trials. Again, thinking of clinical operations, manufacturing, preclinical across the board, they're large teams, and that includes companies that outsource. So ultimately, it's being really thoughtful about who you bring on when, thinking about what skill sets you really need, whether they be full-time, fractional, or consulting, and often being creative about how to solve some of those problems.
Super interesting. Touching on what you just said about, outsourcing and building a team, how do you decide when you're in these positions when to go in-house versus when to outsource? Like, when is the right time to go the functional service provider route?
Sure. So a functional service provider route is a little bit different. I mean, we talk about full service outsourcing to a CRO, and that means soup to nuts. We need your support for everything. We want you to subcontract all of our specialty vendors, et cetera. The FSP model is a little bit different, and that is what we see when we have some internal skill sets, but maybe not all. I see a lot of mid-sized companies use this where they need, maybe they're running international trials, they need international support, but they have a strong internal team. Maybe they need regulatory support. Maybe they have all the clinical operations support they need, but they still need data management, programming, biostats. It's being able to sort of pick and choose from a menu what services you need based on what services your team does not have internal expertise for. That's kind of where we see that FSP model being really effective. Now, tiny biotech companies, you don't typically see that FSP model. Why? Because there's very little internal support. Now, we still do that same evaluation. We look at who we have and what we're strong at. Often these companies are a string of random individuals that come together, and we sit at the table and think, gosh, we've got a lot of great expertise in this and this, but we're going to need a consultant to support us here. But when we're talking about CROs, when we're talking about vendors, labs, et cetera, it's very difficult for a small company. In fact, I'd call it impossible not to fully outsource, because if you're going to run a trial that's bigger than, say, a single center trial close to where you live, the impact of that is very, very difficult. Our trial, or the way we run trials, still runs the way, in many ways, the way it did 20 years ago. We're still manually reviewing data. So if we have trial sites in other countries where they speak other languages, we're going to need to outsource those pieces of that trial, because unless I learn to speak every language out there that I'm going to conduct a trial in, and I've been in more than 50 countries, that's one piece that we have to scale in order to really efficiently interact with the sites. So there's really a lot to that, but it's really a matter of looking at what skill sets you have internally, how broad and thick your internal resources are, and are you plugging some holes, i.e. an FSP model, or do you just need boots on the ground? And then, your role then as the sponsor is to oversee that CRO. And oversee is tricky. I mean, we go through a very extensive vendor selection process, CRO selection process. We should really vet that CRO, not just for their capabilities, but for the specific team assigned. We should look very closely at all of the third-party vendors that we contract with, whether that be a tech vendor, an ePro vendor, a lab. These are all, lengthy processes that we go through, and the sooner that we can go through those processes and form partnerships, the better.
You mentioned vetting CROs. What are some of the criteria that you're looking for when you're looking at a CRO? What makes a CRO competitive to you from your position?
And that is so dependent on the molecule, the protocol, the therapy area. There is no one size fits all approach here. And you'll notice there are a ton of CROs out there, and they're all probably a perfect fit for someone, for one trial. I am always evaluating what I need based off of the protocol that's in front of me, the team that I have, the company that I'm working at, the resources that I have. And so each process really is different. Am I looking at a really early phase trial in a very specific region? Am I looking at a gigantic global phase trial where I really need to be in a whole bunch of different regions and geographies? What patient profile am I looking for? Where am I going to find those patients? I need a skilled team. Again, it may not just be clinical operations. What other functions do I need that CRO to provide me, and how much expertise do they have providing those functions? There are advantages and disadvantages to big CROs versus small and niche CROs. I'd make an argument that sometimes bigger is better, and I'd also make an argument that sometimes the big guys are not the right fit for smaller companies. And there's so many criteria for how leaders make those decisions. We could talk about that for hours on end, frankly, to really go into the nuances of it. But frankly, again, you want someone who is the best fit for your project. You want a CRO who's really committed to being your partner, i.e., we hear a lot of times that small companies get the D team from a big CRO. That happens, but that's not necessarily true. All of it comes down to really evaluating that CRO, setting up a partnership, making sure that you're visible to their senior leadership team, making sure that your leadership team is engaged with their leadership team, making sure that the team that's assigned to your trial is the right team for you. And so there's a lot that goes into that process before actually selecting a CRO. And there are a lot of ways to do it. There aren't industry standard requirements for this is how a CRO has to be selected, but you are required to be able to demonstrate and document the diligence you did when selecting that CRO. And that's part of the trial documentation that you generate.
I'd love to take a step back and sort of talk about when you go into a position where you're going to be standing up a scalable clinical operations sort of infrastructure. What are the first things you start with? Like, what is your number one priority when you go into these roles where you're going to be setting up the clinical operations infrastructure?
Yeah, so I'd say getting to know what's already in place. So that means who's already there. There's going to be some folks that are already in place, whether that be a CEO, a CMO, other leaders, what expertise is in-house. And that's going to help guide what expertise is going to need to be hired elsewhere. So again, that could be clinical operations, it could be regulatory, but I just mean those core functions. Forget the CRO, forget the vendors. We haven't gotten that far. Really assessing what expertise your team internally has. Say you've got a really strong program manager, but you don't have a lot of CMC support. Maybe you need help on the preclinical side. Really looking holistically at the team, at the company, and what's present. And then thinking about infrastructure. You don't want to over-engineer a small company. Small companies are known for being scrappy, and they should be. One of the classic things you hear is that they are building the plane while flying it, and that often is what happens. But you do want to have some structure in place in terms of how you're going to operate. And sometimes that's some very basic SOPs. Sometimes that's, some business related infrastructure. How are we going to deal with things like computers and invoices and so on and so forth? Sometimes that's thinking through, hiring plans, in a quarter, in a year, in 2 years, best case scenario, who are we going to want to bring on, when, why, at what levels? And so sort of putting that HR hat on and thinking through how to scale, again, best case scenario in mind, maybe some other scenarios, that are built out to, and then, if this is a clinical product, where is it? Is it in-licensed to this company? Is it something this company has developed internally? What are the next steps that are required for that product? Is it additional CMC development? And by that, I mean chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. Are there other preclinical studies that need to be run in order to, clear your pathway towards an IND or a CTA if you're operating in a different country? Are you ready for a clinical trial? Are you ready to file an IND or a CTA? So there's a lot of sort of review and analysis that needs to take place to kind of figure out where things are, and that helps determine next steps. And sometimes outlining kind of that status on whether it's a pitch deck because you're going out and looking at funding, or some internal slides to kind of figure out, here's where we are, here's what's missing. If you're bringing on an asset that's belonged to someone else, a gap analysis is a really important step to kind of figure out what that company did, what they didn't do, and how that's going to impact the path forward as well. So, those 30, 60, 90 days, we want to move as fast as we can, but we also really want to make sure that we understand what we're dealing with. And that's going to best inform how we make next steps.
So seems like a lot of analysis, a lot of mapping, a lot of getting a lay of the land before you decide what to do next.
To
Doing
the
your due
extent that you
diligence.
can, that's ideal. Most founders will tell you that they want to be in the clinic tomorrow, and that's great. That's absolutely fine. So it's balancing, speed with being really thoughtful and making sure your clinical development plan is going to see you through, making sure your protocol is well written and executable, making sure that you've gotten feedback from folks like KOLs in the space, that you know your therapy area, that you know where you're going to find your patients, that you know who the right vendor partners, consultants, fractionals, et cetera, are going to be. So it can be really frantic at the beginning because there's momentum and maybe there's, an influx of funding, whether that be a seed round or otherwise. So, what can we do, and how little can we spend in order to start to move the needle forward? Because when we're working on funding, it's all about showing, not just here's the science, here's the medicine that we have, but here's how we're going to operationalize that. Here's how we're going to demonstrate value to you. And so those are all things that kind of need to be thought through quickly up front.
For sure. And we've talked a lot about the sort of like the people aspect of things and the process aspect of things. Do you have any sort of technology must-haves once you get started with this? Like, are there certain systems that are a priority for you to get in place, or is there
Well,
anything in that regard?
that is a great question, and it's a bit fully loaded. What you usually see at small companies is a lot of spreadsheets, a lot of Word documents, a lot of PowerPoint presentations. Think old school tech. One thing that I find really important nowadays post-COVID is a Part 11 compliant DocuSign system, whether it be DocuSign or otherwise. Wedding signatures, we still need them sometimes, frankly, with different regulators, but being able to sign documents in an FDA compliant manner is really helpful. And that's one system that you usually bring on pretty quickly, but we're often, as small biotechs, we're often reliant on the systems of the CRO. So an EDC system is a very expensive system to onboard and build and oversee and manage. Unless you have a team of people that are going to be in a position to do that, that's not necessarily something that you're going to do yourself. There are a million different other instances like that, but small companies are often reluctant to invest in technology because they can get it via service providers, and because that capital is so tight that systems are not usually the first place that we think. Again, think scrappy. So, I am the queen of spreadsheets. And one thing that I am seeing a lot of right now is the rise of additional technologies, AI-based technologies, clinical trial tech companies that are really out there trying to solve some of those manual processes that we do, and we do them because we are so resource constrained. But I'm really looking forward to seeing how that field evolves. I think there are some really interesting companies that are doing interesting things out there to really move the needle forward. We have to think through how to do that in a compliant way, in a way that regulators are going to accept. And so that's one reason you see, I think, reluctance in the industry to implement new technologies, because we do work in a heavily regulated industry, and it's something that we really have to always have at the back of our minds. Are we inspection ready? But small companies, like I said, they often are using the CRO's TMF. They're using the CRO's EDC. They're using the CRO's CTMS. They're reliant on those CROs for systems, which is another reason why building those partnerships early, upfront, and assessing for fit, it's, can you support me with all of these various technology pieces? Because I won't necessarily be able to in-source, build, oversee those on my own.
For sure. Especially speaking to the point about the resource constraints, that's obviously something I hear a lot, and it's such a big
Oh,
problem in our
sure.
industry is simply no access to the budget
Yeah.
to get those tools. I'm curious if, in your experience, if there's been times when you do really strongly believe that there are certain tools that the company needs to get in place, but there's
Mhm.
this hesitancy. Like, do you have any sort of advice or strategies for managing buy-in when it comes to introducing new software?
Yeah, sure. So it's all about ROI. Can you demonstrate return on investment? And for small companies, that is shorter timelines, cheaper trials. So if you can effectively demonstrate to your executive team that a certain technology will make something shorter, i.e., get data faster, and will make your overall trial cheaper, that's really the kind of that's the kind of sale that you need to make to an executive team. Executive teams are never intimately involved in clinical operations. Of course, they're you're meeting with them. They're aware of the trial, the progress, the scope, the budget. They're aware of those big ticket items, but in terms of day-to-day micro-based operations, those aren't things that they're going to be involved in. So when explaining to them why a certain technology might be important, context is king. And the bottom line is always going to be ROI. If I can show how it's going to make my trial cheaper or faster in a small or large way, move that needle, that's how I'm really going to get their attention.
And is sort of is de-risking ever something you speak to when it comes to getting buy-in for new clinical software, like that sort of positioning yourself for funding opportunities or different things in the future and making sure that you've got everything sort of compliant and in place?
I think de-risking it can be used in a lot of different ways. We always want to conduct audit-ready trials, absolutely. But de-risking can mean a lot of different things. Documentation is a huge part of that. So you've seen the industry move over time from paper documentation to eTMF. An eTMF system is a big chunk to bite off for a startup company. So you need it. But again, the sticker price attached to an eTMF system is not going to fall into that budget for a startup. It's very rare that a startup would implement one on their own. Again, I'm talking very high dollar amounts from what we see. And you also have to be able to build the system, validate the system. You may not have the internal expertise to do those things. So again, it's finding a partner who is really going to partner with you on that. Of course, we want to de-risk things where we can, but again, it depends on what the software is, where the software is going to be implemented, and I'm seeing these things are advancing day by day. We're going to see these types of softwares continue to advance with AI. We're going to find compliant ways to implement them. We're going to be able to reduce costs with some of these solutions because we're reducing time, and again, that leans into ROI. But I think sponsors in general, again, there's not revenue coming in next month. If you're a tech company and you have a product, you may be at a seed stage, but you may still have a product on the market where you have that seed funding round, but you also have revenue. We're not going to have revenue. That's not part of that budget plan, right? So capital gets really constrained. It's very, very closely looked at. And what we raise when we go out to a VC or private equity or however a company goes about raising money, you can't just go and say, I need $20 million, I need $50 million. You're going to have to get much more granular about what that dollar amount is going to get, why that dollar amount. What is that going to support? What specific activities? What value will that bring to the investor? Where are we going to see that value read out in terms of data? So saying to an investor, we need a system is often a difficult conversation because they don't see how that system ultimately results in additional value that's being created for the company and therefore the investor. Does that make sense?
100%. Thank you so much. So I actually do have a follow-up question, what you were mentioning
Okay.
sort of about eTMF software and it
Yeah.
being a really big chunk for smaller companies to digest in terms of budget. What are some of the signs in your eyes that it is time to really consider making that investment? Like, at what point do you
Sure.
say manual's not doing it anymore? We need to make the leap and go digital?
I'm not necessarily saying we go manual. I'm saying we outsource that to a CRO and we use their eTMF. With the exception of very small early phase trials, we want to be away from paper as much as possible. But again, we're going to lean into that CRO. In terms of me bringing it in house and actually owning the system myself, the time I'm going to think about doing that is when I start to have multiple trials, multiple programs, multiple compounds, and I'm starting to increase my audit risk, maybe because I have a later phase program that might be headed towards commercialization. And I have gotten to a point from a budget perspective, or the executive team has raised enough money, again, in support of those clinical programs, that I can kind of spread that out and make that make sense. And I have the internal resources again to manage it, to validate it, to make sure that all of those checks and balances remain. I mean, if we think about TMF, we don't just upload documents, we have to review them, we have to do QC checks on them. All of that is work that has to be managed by someone. So do I have the internal team to support it? Not only do I need the software, I need the IT structure and support to implement it, and I need the team to actually manage the documentation. So there are a lot of layers to thinking through bringing that on. And again, what I look for is a robust enough pipeline where you've got enough products, you want them under your roof, under one TMF, not spread out at different CROs or different different partners. Then your documentation kind of gets a little bit more scattered, more difficult to manage. But there are a lot of considerations that go into that, because again, it's not just buying expensive software. It's managing it, it's maintaining it, it's managing that documentation. Can I bring on a TMS specialist? Can I bring on some additional junior ClinOps folks to manage that documentation? Because those systems, it's not never as simple as just uploading and storing documents. There's an ongoing management that can be very, very resource heavy.
For sure. And especially if you want to stay continuously inspection ready, you need to be
Yes.
willing to invest in
And that
that and do
always
it
needs to be the
continuously.
goal. That needs to be
Yeah.
the goal. So typically we have a TMF plan for a trial, and that's usually written in conjunction with the CRO. The CRO is required, if we're using their TMF, to review the TMF at certain intervals and provide us with those metrics. If we're doing that internally, obviously that all falls to us. Even still, if we're using the TMF that belongs to a CRO, the sponsor is still responsible to oversee that TMF, to spot audit, to spot check that TMF, to make sure that the CRO is doing what they say they're doing. And so, that is also a resource that you have to do, regardless of whether you're using someone's TMF. I suppose you can just trust that they're doing the right thing, but again, that's not providing proper oversight, and that's not, enabling inspection readiness.
Yeah, for sure. Sounds like a lot of your role is balancing sort of financial constraints and organizational priorities and trying to walk the tightrope between the two, if you will.
Absolutely. 100%. Yes. It's wearing different hats. It's solving a lot of different problems. It's having your hands in a lot of different pots. And I think at small companies, it's also being willing to roll up your sleeves and do any task. If I'm an N of one, for example, I'm doing all of that work myself. And at a small company, I might be an N of one, or we might have a CTM. It takes time to build out those teams. And so I have to think about not just the software, but what it takes to implement and manage the software.
For sure. I think I'd love to, if you don't mind, spend the last maybe 10 or 15 minutes or so going over some of your sort of advice for people who are maybe new to the industry, who are new to roles like yours, who are new to clinical
Okay.
operations, and just kind of what you've picked up over the years that you could share with anyone who's in
Okay.
starting out.
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, there's a ton there. I think a couple of pieces of advice I'd pass around is, number one, there is something here for everyone. People arrive at this industry with all kinds of different backgrounds. We have scientists, we have nurses, but we also have art history and music majors and folks that found this path from all different directions. There's a great meme that shows someone just sort of falling out their door, stumbling down the driveway, slipping on ice, and landing into a clinical research role. I mean, we all get here from very different directions, and that's one of the things that makes our community so interesting, so diverse, because we have folks from all different sorts of backgrounds that are contributing. I think the other piece that's important is transferable skills. When I was younger and I was at the site, I heard a lot, oh, well, you're a site, you're a CRC, you're at a site, you can't work at a CRO, you'll never get a job at a sponsor. And I think we've started to dismantle that philosophy some, but it can be tricky for folks to take the transferable skills they've learned and demonstrate to an employer why they're ready to make that move. I would really encourage folks to remember that everything they're learning in the industry matters. And then it's important to think about what that skill might mean if we translate it to what a CRO does or what a sponsor does. I think it's really important that folks understand the differences between sites, CROs, sponsors, vendors, what those different roles look like. There are so many ways too to get involved in this industry. You see folks working in pharmacovigilance, in clinical affairs, med affairs, clinical operations, data management, bench science. There's a million different ways to contribute here. We have lawyers, we have finance people. Really any kind of specialty. We have folks within this industry that are contributing to it in that way. So there's something for everyone. And, I've been really impressed with how the industry has grown too, in terms of the fact that there are now degree programs in things like biomedical research and regulatory affairs. There are certificate programs. There's a lot more supportive infrastructure out there to teach people how to become a CRC, become a CRA, upskill to a CTM. And so really leaning into those skills, I think networking is huge. Finding both mentors, but also sponsors who see, the value you bring to the table. It's a small world, and we see groups of people go from company to company to company because they work well together, because they've established rapport and trust. And I've been lucky to be part of some teams like that. But I think, if this is a career you want to pursue, get involved in all of the various things you can get involved in. There are conferences you can attend. Cracking your way into the door is the hardest part often, but there are so many people out there now. And, we have the benefit, which we didn't, when I started in my career, of social media like LinkedIn that allows us to connect with other leaders, thought leaders, people who are in positions that we hope to grow into one day. And, not every single person is going to, be helpful, is going to, provide guidance, but I think you'd be surprised at how many people really do want to pay it forward. I myself am always happy to jump on a call and try to help provide some guidance where I can. And I've even doubled down on that and started providing some one-on-one coaching to folks that are trying to make some of these pivots, or, be seen as someone that could be effective at a CRO or a sponsor, someone who's promotion ready, what have you. It's often tough to navigate. There are so many silos, again, in this industry, and those impact those employees too that are trying to navigate it. So, I like to look at the industry as a whole and help folks navigate it that way to the extent that that's possible. But I fell into this industry too. I completely stumbled upon it. And I've loved kind of unfolding the layers of the onion, that is clinical development or clinical operations or drug development. I think there's so much that it can offer. And I love that there's more visibility on the industry, but I think there's more that we can do in order to make it more accessible and more visible, all the good things that are happening behind the scenes.
For sure. I love what you said about providing coaching. I think, that could be such an inflection point in someone's career, just to have that sort of like guidance and a helping hand trying to sort through everything. And I also love what you said about how we're sort of starting to see those educational gaps being filled more and more over time.
Yeah.
We always have a joke oh, you didn't learn TMF at university. Like it's not a degree that you get at university,
No,
but
that's
maybe
correct.
that's a direction you're going. You know, there's more and more resources that are available for people to actually go out and learn those skills that you kind of had to just
Yeah,
absorb through osmosis before or going and doing
right.
something you were
Exactly.
comfortable with. Yeah,
Which is wonderful. And I think it's reflective of the fact that it's a large industry, it's a growing industry, and it's an industry that, despite how backwards it often feels or behind it often feels, it is definitely an industry that wants to evolve, wants to grow, wants to support folks, at different career stages or different parts of the industry. It's really just connecting yourself with the people who support you and believe in you, and again, you never know where those people are gonna be. They might be at your current site or CRO or sponsor. They might be on LinkedIn. They might be on a podcast or an interview. You never know where they're going to be. So, forge those relationships and think of it. And, this is something I've had to learn over time. Think of it rather than, hey, I need something, help me. Think of it as planting seeds. Think of it as building relationships for the long term. Think of it as making sure that you stay top of mind for that person and offer them something in return. It's hard. Leaders get a lot of messages in their inbox, and I think leaders always try to engage to the extent we can with everyone that we can. But our time is often very limited, and I encourage folks to really think of that relationship building as a long-term goal, rather than I'm going to go out there and I'm going to get all the CEOs to talk to me and they're all going to want to hire me. That's not necessarily how it works. But I think folks have the best of intentions, and there are really folks out there who have climbed up the hard way and really want to give back to the community.
for sure. And my last question before I let you out of the hot seat here is directed toward leadership specifically. So people who are executives, CEOs, COOs, CFOs, who are new to clinical development specifically, what are the key things that you think they should watch out for in the industry? What's your advice to other people who are coming in at that executive level in clinical development?
It's a fair question, and to be honest, it's not necessarily something that you see super frequently. You don't necessarily see folks, for example, from big tech coming over to lead biotech companies. You see a lot of organic development. You see a lot of folks being sponsored that are rising through the ranks. It does happen, absolutely, but those folks are out there pounding the pavement, making a case for themselves, often because, especially at the executive level, it's yes, there are transferable skills, but there are so many strong leaders that already have those skills, and those are the first people that folks are going to go to. I even see folks having a tough time, making moves between, say, health technology or commercial health spaces and biotechnology or drug and device development, because they are very nuanced, different worlds. Networking is key. Getting to the conferences and getting in the rooms with the other folks that are doing that work or making decisions is important. Again, building transferable skills and being able to tell the story of why what you've done relates to the role that you're applying to. It's important for any job interview or any application that you're going to make. And we're seeing so many jobs posted on LinkedIn. I think the power of person to person, in-person connections, whether that be reaching out to people at that company on LinkedIn, building relationships, that's going to be very powerful here. It may not be this role, it may be a role down the road. There are also professional societies and organizations that support leaders that are kind of trying to reposition themselves. The executive level is a totally different story. There are 2 points that I have found that are really difficult to crack. Getting to the director level is really tough. Getting to that VP level is really tough. But the C-suite is a very different world, and it's one that's tricky to navigate. And the thing that I have found most effective in getting that title is to have a sponsor who has been there before you, maybe has a complementary skill set that you've worked with, and is going to help you, help you develop the skills and fill the gaps that you're missing, because it is a really difficult road to climb. And it's not necessarily an easy transition to make from industry to industry.
Totally fair. And I think what you said is super important. You've hammered home the points about networking and about the importance of like just building those connections with people, even if you don't know where that's necessarily going
Yeah.
to take you. That's, I think, very crucial.
Definitely.
Um,
Definitely is.
that being said, we are approaching the end of our interview.
Mhm.
I just wanted to ask if there's anything else you wanted to talk about or any final points you'd like to make before we wrap things up.
Oh, thanks, Molly. I appreciate that. I'm really excited about the future of clinical research. I think we're on the crux of something that could be really, really incredible. I think that if we come together as an ecosystem, sites, CROs, sponsors, that truly with the patient in mind, and really try to break down some of the silos that we've seen. We really try to implement technology in a thoughtful, compliant manner. I think there's a lot that we can do to improve the drug development process, make drug development faster, make it more efficient, make it cheaper. But we're going to have to work together as an industry rather than as sponsors, CROs, sites, etc. So the more barriers that we can break down, the better we're going to be, the more successful we're going to be at bringing therapies to patients.
I love that. No, that's super important. Um, so thank you so much for your time, Suzanne. I
My
really
pleasure.
appreciated you sitting down with me, hearing all of your insights and experiences. This was super insightful for me. And yeah, I
Good.
really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, Molly. It was a pleasure joining you, and I look forward to continuing to chat with you.
Me as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you.